You play like a street busker who wandered in off 7th Avenue. Get out of here!
Those words would echo through Maestro Frank Zollner's conscience for the rest of his life, but in that moment, he laughed as if he had just delivered the punchline of the century. Charlotte Bennett stood beneath the warm stage lights of Carnegie Hall, her violin tucked beneath her chin, her bow still hovering in the air where the music had been ripped from her hands. Around her, 98 of the finest classical musicians in the world sat in stunned, mortified silence, their instruments resting in their laps like wounded birds. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of crisp New York morning when the city seemed to hum with possibility, and Charlotte had arrived at the artist's entrance 2 hours early, the way she always did. Her grandmother had taught her that lesson when she was 7 years old.
Baby, when you walk into a room that doesn't expect you, you walk in twice as prepared and 3 times as early.
So Charlotte had been there since 6:30 in the morning, warming up alone in a small practice room on the 3rd floor, running through Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major for the 100th time that week. The New York Philharmonic's first-chair second violinist had suffered a severe wrist injury 2 nights before, and Charlotte's name had been pulled from a substitute list maintained by the orchestra's personnel manager. She had been given 36 hours to prepare for the most important rehearsal of her career. Now, 20 minutes into that rehearsal, the wild-haired Austrian conductor had stopped the entire symphony mid-phrase, slammed his baton against his music stand with a crack like a gunshot, and turned on her with the slow, theatrical malice of a man who had been waiting for an excuse. Have you ever watched a powerful man humiliate a stranger and felt something break inside you? Charlotte felt that something, but she did not let it show on her face. Miss Bennett, Frank Zollner said, drawing out her name with the kind of mocking precision that European conservatory professors reserve for students they intend to fail. Would you be so kind as to inform this orchestra what country produced the composer of this concerto? Charlotte's voice was steady when she answered. Russia, maestro. Tchaikovsky. Zollner smiled, but the smile did not reach his pale gray eyes. Russia. Correct. A European country. And would you be so kind as to inform this orchestra what continent has produced almost every great violinist of the last 3 centuries? The musicians around her began to lower their eyes. The principal cellist, a kind older man named Yevgeny Petrov, stared at his shoes. From the wings, 2 stagehands had quietly raised their phones and begun to record. Europe, maestro, Charlotte answered, and her voice did not tremble, though her heart had begun to beat like a kettle drum against her ribs. Then perhaps, Miss Bennett, you would explain to me why I am hearing, in my orchestra, on my stage, in the temple of Carnegie Hall, the phrasing of a street busker who has wandered in off 7th Avenue to play for tourists who do not know any better. Zollner's voice rose into the rafters of the great hall, climbing the gilded balconies, bouncing off the painted ceiling. He turned in a slow circle, addressing the entire orchestra as if Charlotte were a specimen pinned to a board. Listen to her bow arm. Listen to her vibrato. There is no European discipline. There is no European restraint. There is rhythm, yes, plenty of rhythm, very impressive rhythm, but where is the soul of Vienna? Where is the precision of Berlin? Where is the architecture of Leipzig? The hall had gone so silent that Charlotte could hear the faint hiss of the air conditioning vents high above. 40 feet to her left, the principal flutist, a young Korean woman named Mina Park, had her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes shining with tears she would not let fall. The concertmaster, a 60-year-old Israeli named David Horowitz, had set his violin across his knees and was gripping the edge of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. He had played under Zollner for 11 seasons. He had seen this performance before. He had seen it directed at a Korean cellist in 2019, at a Mexican oboist in 2021, at a young black trumpet player from Detroit just 6 months ago. He had always sat silently. He hated himself for it every time. Charlotte lowered her violin slowly, deliberately, and rested it on her left shoulder. She did not argue. She did not weep. She did not even blink. Instead, she did something that made every musician in the orchestra look up in startled confusion. She reached down into the small leather satchel resting against the leg of her chair, and she withdrew a thin, weathered folder of yellowed paper. The folder was perhaps the size of a paperback book, bound in cracked brown leather that had clearly been handled many times across many decades, and when Charlotte opened it, the soft rustle of old paper was the only sound in Carnegie Hall. Zollner stared at her with an expression that mingled curiosity and contempt, as if he were watching a child attempt to read a contract. "What is this, Miss Bennett? A note from your mother explaining your absence from European discipline?" A few uncomfortable laughs trickled out from the brass section, but they died quickly, smothered by the strange weight that had begun to gather in the air. Charlotte did not look up at him. She was studying the page in her hand, her fingertips brushing the edge of the paper with a tenderness that seemed entirely out of place in that hostile room. "Maestro," she said quietly, "I would like to ask your permission to play one piece. Not from the program. Not from the repertoire. One piece of my own choosing. 60 seconds. That is all I ask." Zollner's eyebrows climbed toward his wild silver hair, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his mouth. He turned to the orchestra and spread his arms wide, as if inviting them to share in the comedy. "The substitute wishes to perform for us." The substitute, who cannot phrase a Russian melody to the standards of this institution, wishes to bestow upon us a private recital. He looked back at her, and his voice dropped into something more dangerous, more amused. "By all means, Miss Bennett. 60 seconds. Use them wisely. Because at the end of 60 seconds, I shall be calling the personnel office to inform them that this orchestra requires a different substitute for tonight's performance, and you shall be returning to whatever street corner first inspired your interpretive choices." A gasp went up from the woodwinds. The principal violist, a soft-spoken black man named Marcus Johnson, set his instrument down and rose halfway from his chair, his face dark with anger. He had been the only black principal in the orchestra for 12 years, and he had endured his share of barbed comments from Zollner, but this was something different. This was open contempt directed at a guest, a young woman, in front of an entire ensemble, in the most famous concert hall in America. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but Charlotte met his eyes across the stage and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Sit," her eyes said. "Trust me. Sit." Marcus sank back into his seat, his hands trembling against his thighs. Charlotte placed the open folder onto her music stand. She did not need to read the music, but she wanted it there, the way a soldier wants a photograph of home in his breast pocket. The page was handwritten in faded brown ink, the staff lines drawn by hand with a ruler, the notes shaped with the careful loops of someone who had learned to write music in a place where printed manuscript paper was a luxury. At the top of the page, in a delicate cursive script, were 3 words in a language that none of the musicians in that orchestra could read, but that Charlotte's grandmother had whispered into her ear every night for the first 8 years of her life. The words were Romanian. They meant, "For our friend." Beneath them, in the same hand, was a date. April 16, 1945. And beneath the date, a single name. Iosif. Charlotte raised her violin. She closed her eyes. From the wings, the 2 stagehands holding their phones pressed record more firmly, sensing without quite understanding that something extraordinary was about to happen. In the 3rd row of the empty house, where the orchestra's general manager had been silently observing the entire rehearsal, a woman named Linda Castellanos set down her coffee cup and leaned forward in her seat. She had been about to march down to the stage and intervene in the most public disciplinary fashion of her career. Something stopped her. Some instinct that had served her well over 30 years in the music business told her to wait. To watch. To listen. Charlotte drew her bow across the lowest string of her violin, and the first note that emerged was not the bright, polished sound of a virtuoso showing off her technique. It was something deeper, something rougher, something older. It was the sound of a voice singing in a small village kitchen at the end of a long day. It was the sound of a father humming to a frightened child during a winter storm. It was the sound of a melody that had been carried on the breath of one human being to another, across mountains, across oceans, across decades, across the unspeakable wounds of history, and it filled Carnegie Hall the way water fills a cup, slowly, gently, completely. Maestro Frank Zollner heard the first 3 notes, and his face went white. The notes climbed slowly out of the violin like steam rising from a kettle, simple at first, almost childlike in their melody, but carrying within them the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. The tune was in a minor key, with strange intervals that did not belong to any classical tradition the orchestra had ever studied. It bent and curled like smoke, sliding between the half-steps the way a human voice does when it is too tired to speak but cannot bear to remain silent. Charlotte's bow moved with a tenderness that made the brilliant Tchaikovsky concerto she had been playing 5 minutes earlier seem suddenly like a child's exercise. This was something else. This was the music of a kitchen at 3 in the morning. This was the music of a man washing dishes in the dark because he could not sleep and did not wish to wake his family with his crying. Frank Zollner stood at the conductor's podium with his baton hanging limp from his fingers. His mouth had fallen slightly open, and his pale gray eyes had gone wide with a recognition that traveled across his face like a wave moving across the surface of a lake. He took 1 step backward, then another, until his hand found the edge of the podium and gripped it for support. He did not understand what he was hearing. He understood it completely. Both of these things were true at the same time, and the impossibility of them being true together was beginning to crack him open. Across the orchestra, the musicians were leaning forward in their seats. None of them had been told what Charlotte was going to play. None of them had ever heard this melody before. And yet there was something about it that made the principal oboist set down her instrument and press both hands against her chest. There was something about it that made the timpanist, a gruff Russian man named Sergei who had not cried in public since the death of his mother in 1998, blink rapidly and stare hard at the ceiling. Marcus Johnson, the principal violist, was watching Charlotte with an expression that had transformed completely from anger to wonder. He had been a professional musician for 31 years. He knew when he was hearing something that did not belong to the world of concert halls and conservatories. He knew when he was hearing something that had been carried out of a real human life, a real human kitchen, a real human grief. In the 3rd row of the empty house, Linda Castellanos felt her hand drift slowly up to cover her mouth. She had attended thousands of rehearsals over the course of her career, and she had heard every major violinist in the world play in this very hall. She had never heard anything like this. Not because of the technique, which was extraordinary in its restraint, but because of the thing the technique was carrying. The melody was a vessel, and inside the vessel was a memory, and the memory belonged to someone else, but Charlotte was pouring it out into the hall with the careful hands of a daughter who had been entrusted with something irreplaceable. Zollner's knees began to tremble. He could see his father's face. He had not been able to see his father's face clearly in 17 years, not since the funeral, not since the long, slow disappearance of his father into the cancer that had hollowed him out month by month. But now, listening to a young black violinist play a melody that no one in America should have known, Zollner could see his father as clearly as if the old man were standing in the front row. He could see Iosif Zollner in his small Vienna apartment, sitting at the kitchen table in his worn brown cardigan, humming this very tune under his breath as he sliced an apple into thin, even pieces. He could see his father in the doorway of his childhood bedroom, singing this melody to him during a thunderstorm when he was 6 years old and frightened of the lightning. He could see his father at the piano, picking out these notes with one finger because he had never learned to play properly, and saying in his soft, accented English, "This is the song that kept me alive, Franz. This is the song of the friend." Zollner had asked, hundreds of times across his life, what the song was called. He had asked who had taught it to his father. He had asked, when he was old enough to understand the tattoo of numbers on his father's left forearm, whether the song had a name and whether his father could write it down. Iosif had always smiled and shaken his head. "I cannot read music well enough to write it. And the name, Franz, is a name in a language I do not speak. I only know that it was given to me as a gift, and that I will carry it in my chest until the day I die." Iosif had died on a Thursday afternoon in February of 2009, humming the melody under his breath. For 40 years, Frank Zollner had searched. For 40 years, Frank Zollner had searched. He had searched the archives of the Vienna State Opera, where he had taken his first conducting position at the age of 26. He had searched the dusty shelves of the Jewish Music Research Center in Jerusalem during a sabbatical in 1991. He had hired a Romanian musicologist in 1997 to comb through the folk song collections of the Bucharest Academy. He had paid a young ethnomusicologist from Yale $15,000 in 2003 to record interviews with elderly Holocaust survivors across Europe, playing them what he could remember of the melody on a small cassette recorder, asking each of them, "Do you know this song? Have you ever heard this song? Does this song belong to anyone you remember?" Not one of them had recognized it. Not one in 243 interviews. He had begun to wonder, in the late nights when sleep would not come to him, whether his father had simply invented the melody himself, whether the song of the friend was a private composition of a frightened man trying to soothe himself in the worst place a human being can be. And now, in his concert hall, on his stage, played by the young woman he had just publicly humiliated, the song had returned. The notes that he had carried in his memory for nearly his entire life, the notes he had hummed to himself in showers and elevators and during long walks through Central Park, the notes he had once played softly into his father's hospital room in the final week of the old man's life, those notes were filling Carnegie Hall and they were exactly right. They were not approximate. They were not similar. They were exact. Every interval, every ornament, every strange little hesitation in the third measure that he had always assumed was a quirk of his father's memory, every one of these things was present in Charlotte's playing, as if she had been taught the song by the same teacher who had taught his father. A sound escaped from Zollner's throat that was not quite a word. It was a sound between a gasp and a sob, the sound a child makes when they wake from a nightmare and reach for a parent who is no longer in the room. Several of the musicians in the front of the orchestra turned to look at him. The first oboist, who had played under Zollner for 14 years and had never once seen him display any emotion stronger than mild irritation, felt her heart begin to pound. David Horowitz, the concertmaster, slowly stood from his chair, his violin still resting in his lap. He had been raised in a household where the Holocaust was not a chapter in a history book but a memory that lived in the kitchen and the living room and the silences at the dinner table. His own grandmother had survived their Scienstadt. His grandfather had not. He recognized something in the melody that Charlotte was playing, not the specific tune, but the country of its origin, the dialect of its soul. This was music that had been written, or remembered, or carried, by people who had walked through fire and come out the other side missing pieces of themselves they would never recover. He knew this kind of music. He had heard it in his grandmother's voice on the rare nights when she could be persuaded to sing. Charlotte played on, her eyes still closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the song. She was not performing. She was not demonstrating her technique. She was doing what her grandmother had taught her to do when she sang this lullaby to her as a small girl, falling asleep in a small house on a quiet street in Macon, Georgia. She was telling the truth. The melody had 3 sections. The first was the opening, the simple statement of the tune, the way a storyteller begins by saying once upon a time. The second was the middle passage, a brief modulation upward into a brighter key, a moment of remembered light, the way one remembers laughter at a kitchen table before everything changed. And the third was the return to the opening melody, but slower now, and softer, the way grief returns to a person who has lived with it for so long that they no longer fight it but instead carry it gently, the way one carries a sleeping child. When Charlotte reached the second section, the brief modulation upward, the moment of remembered light, Frank Zollner's knees gave way completely. He did not fall, exactly. He sank, slowly, like a man being lowered into water, until he was sitting on the floor of the conductor's podium with his back against the metal railing and his face buried in his hands. His shoulders began to shake. He made no sound for a moment, and then, very softly, in a voice that none of his musicians had ever heard him use, he began to weep. The melody returned to its opening phrase, slower and softer than before, and Charlotte's bow moved with the patience of a hand smoothing a blanket over a sleeping child. The orchestra had stopped breathing. No one was looking at their music. No one was looking at the conductor. They were all looking at the young black woman in the simple black concert dress, with the long thin braids gathered at the back of her head, who had walked into Carnegie Hall that morning as a substitute and who was now playing something that none of them quite understood but all of them could feel pressing against their chests like a hand reaching through a doorway. The final note of the song was held for what seemed like a very long time, a sustained whisper of sound that thinned gradually into silence, the way a candle flame thins before going out. And then it was gone. Charlotte lowered her violin and opened her eyes. She looked at Frank Zollner, who was still seated on the floor of the conductor's podium with his face in his hands. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply waited, the way her grandmother had taught her to wait when she had said something important and was allowing it to land. The silence in Carnegie Hall stretched and stretched. 10 seconds. 15. 20. From the wings, the two stagehands with their phones were trembling. Neither of them had any musical training. Neither of them knew what they had just witnessed. They only knew that the air in the hall had changed, that something had happened that did not happen in this place, and that they were holding the only recording of it that existed. It was Linda Castellanos, the general manager in the third row of the house, who finally stood. She had not realized that tears were rolling down her cheeks until she felt them drop onto her hand. She did not call out. She did not interrupt. She simply stood, as if rising in respect for something she could not name. Frank Zollner lifted his head slowly. His face was wet, and his pale gray eyes, which had glittered with such contempt only minutes before, were now red and swollen and entirely unguarded. He looked at Charlotte the way a drowning man looks at a hand extended over the side of a boat. He tried to speak. His voice would not come at first. He cleared his throat, but the gesture was useless. The thing that had been blocking his throat was not a physical obstruction. It was the wreckage of 40 years of searching, collapsing all at once into a single moment that he had not prepared for and did not know how to survive. "Where," he said finally, and the word came out as little more than a whisper, the breath of a syllable. He tried again. "Where did you learn that song?" Charlotte looked at him steadily. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not vindictive. It was something closer to compassion, the kind of compassion that one human being offers to another when they have just watched a wound open and are about to help that person bandage it. She lowered her violin into her left hand and rested the scroll against her hip. "My grandmother taught it to me," she said. "She sang it to me every night when I was a little girl. She said it was a lullaby. She said it had been a gift to our family, a long time ago, in a country across the ocean." Zollner pressed his hand against his mouth. A small sound escaped from behind it. The principal cellist, Yevgeny Petrov, slowly set his cello down and walked across the stage. He was 68 years old, and his joints ached every morning, but he moved now with the careful purpose of a man approaching something sacred. He knelt beside the conductor and placed his hand gently on the older man's shoulder. He did not say anything. He simply remained there, his hand resting on the shaking shoulder of a man he had served under for 9 seasons, a man he had often disliked, a man who was now broken open on the floor of a stage in front of 98 of his colleagues. Zollner looked up at Charlotte again. His mouth worked silently for a moment before the words emerged. "Your grandmother," he said. "Your grandmother. What was her name?" Charlotte set her violin and bowed gently on her chair, freeing both of her hands, and walked the few steps toward the music stand where her grandmother's small leather folder still lay open. She closed the folder with the same tenderness she had used to open it. She turned back to face the conductor. "My grandmother's name was Ruby Bennett," she said. "But her father, my great-grandfather, was a man named Samuel Bennett. He was a sergeant in the United States Army. He was 23 years old in the spring of 1945. Zollner closed his eyes. He already knew. Somehow, impossibly, he already knew. He was with the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, Charlotte said quietly, her voice carrying easily in the hush of the great hall, because there was no other sound to compete with it. They were attached to General Patton's Third Army. They were among the first American units to enter the Order of Concentration Camp on April 4, 1945. My great-grandfather was 23 years old, and he had never seen anything like what he saw inside the wire of that camp. Zollner's hands trembled in his lap. Yevgeny's hand remained on his shoulder, steady and patient. 12 days later, on April 16, the same battalion moved on to a place called Buchenwald. The main camp had already been liberated 5 days earlier by other American units, but my great-grandfather's company was assigned to assist with the medical evacuation and the registration of survivors. He worked in the infirmary tents that had been set up just outside the main gate. Charlotte paused, gathering the story carefully, the way her grandmother had gathered it when she had first told it to her, sitting on the porch swing of the small house in Macon when Charlotte was 12 years old. There was a man in one of the infirmary cots who was not expected to live through the night. He was perhaps 40 pounds. He had been a violinist before the war. The doctors had set him aside, because they did not have the resources to save everyone, and they were focusing on the patients who had a chance. My great-grandfather, who had grown up singing in a black Baptist church in Georgia and who carried tunes in his head the way other men carried photographs in their wallets, walked past this man's cot and saw that he was awake. So he stopped. And he sat down on the edge of the cot. And he began to hum. The orchestra was silent. Across the stage, the principal harpist, a quiet woman from Indianapolis named Catherine Bell, had begun to weep into her hand, her shoulders shaking. My great-grandfather hummed a black spiritual, Charlotte said. It was called Steal Away. It is a song that enslaved people used to sing in the fields when they were planning to escape, but they sang it as if it were only about God, so that the overseers would not understand. My great-grandfather did not know that the man in the cot was Romanian. He did not know that the man in the cot did not speak English. He only knew that the man was alive and that he was alone and that the company chaplain had told him that sometimes the only thing you can give a dying man is the sound of another human voice. So he hummed. And the man in the cot opened his eyes. And the man in the cot listened. And after a long time, the man in the cot lifted one finger and tapped it, very weakly, against my great-grandfather's hand, which was resting on the edge of the cot. And then the man in the cot began to hum, too. But the tune he hummed was not Steal Away. The tune he hummed was the song you just heard me play. Zollner made a sound that was not quite a word. Charlotte continued. My great-grandfather stayed by that cot for the rest of his night shift. He did not leave. He kept humming, and the man in the cot kept humming with him, in their two different songs, in their two different languages, in their two different worlds that had collided on the floor of an infirmary tent outside a German concentration camp. And in the morning, when my great-grandfather's shift ended, the man was still alive. And when my great-grandfather came back the next night, the man was still alive. And by the end of the week, the doctors had moved the man off the list of patients who were not expected to live, and onto the list of patients who might survive after all. And by the end of the month, the man was strong enough to sit up in his cot, and my great-grandfather was bringing him small gifts. A piece of chocolate from his rations. A clean handkerchief. A pencil and a piece of paper. She gestured toward the small leather folder on the music stand. On a piece of paper that my great-grandfather gave to him, the man wrote out the melody of his song. He wrote it out in handwriting that he could barely control, because his hands were still very weak, and he wrote at the top of the page 3 words in Romanian. The words were Pentru prietenul nostru. They mean, for our friend. And he wrote a date, April 16, 1945, which was the day they met. And he signed his name. Iosif. Frank Zollner buried his face in his hands and wept openly. The hall held the sound of Frank Zollner's weeping the way a chapel holds a prayer. No one moved. No one tried to comfort him. Yevgeny Petrov remained kneeling beside him with his hand on his shoulder, but he did not speak, because some grief is too sacred to be interrupted with words. Charlotte stood quietly by the music stand, her hands folded in front of her, waiting. She had been waiting her whole life for this moment, although she had never known that this particular moment was the one she was waiting for. Her grandmother had given her the song without explaining what it might one day become. Her grandmother had only said, "Baby, you carry this tune. You carry it gently. You carry it the way you'd carry a candle through a dark hallway. One day, somebody is going to need this candle. And when that day comes, you'll know." After a long time, Zollner lowered his hands. His face was a wreckage of 40 years of unanswered questions and one answered question, all at the same time. He looked up at Charlotte, and his voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who had aged a decade in the space of 15 minutes. "My father's name," he said softly, "was Iosif Zollner. He was born in 1924, in a small village in northern Romania, in a region that is now called Maramureș. He was deported to Auschwitz with his mother and two sisters in May of 1944. His mother and sisters were murdered in the gas chambers within hours of their arrival. He was transferred to a forced labor sub-camp, and then, in the final weeks of the war, he was sent on a death march to Buchenwald. He arrived in early April of 1945, 3 days before the liberation. He weighed 76 pounds. Zollner's voice broke. He gathered himself. He had been a violinist. He had begun his studies at the age of 6. He was considered one of the most promising young musicians in his region before the war. After the war, his hands had been damaged by frostbite during the death march, and he could no longer play the violin. He emigrated to Vienna in 1949. He worked as a tailor for 43 years. He never spoke to me about the camps. He never spoke to me about his mother or his sisters. He only ever spoke to me about one thing from those years. He spoke to me about an American soldier. A black soldier. A young man who sat by his cot in the infirmary tent and hummed a song to him, night after night, until he was strong enough to live. Charlotte's eyes had filled with tears, but her face remained calm. She had heard the other side of this story from her grandmother. She knew it by heart. "My father told me that this soldier saved his life," Zollner continued. "Not because of the medical care, which he received from the doctors, but because of the humming. He told me that there were many men in those infirmary cots who had survived the camps physically but who had decided in their hearts that they did not wish to live in the world anymore, because the world had shown them what it was capable of, and they no longer wished to be part of it. He told me that he had been one of those men. And he told me that the humming of that soldier had reminded him, slowly, over many nights, that there was still tenderness somewhere in the world. There was still kindness somewhere in the world. There was still music somewhere in the world that had not been written to march men to their deaths. And so he had decided to stay alive. Because of the humming." Zollner closed his eyes. A small smile, broken and trembling, appeared on his face. "My father told me that he never learned the soldier's name. The camp records were chaotic in those weeks. The American units rotated frequently. By the time my father was strong enough to walk, the soldiers' company had moved on. He searched, in his way, for many years. He wrote letters to the United States Army. He wrote letters to black veterans organizations. He was told, very politely, that there was no way to identify one black soldier among the many thousands who had served in the European theater. He told me, when I was a young man, that he had given up looking, but that he had carried this soldier in his heart every day of his life. He told me that the song he hummed every night, the song he sang to me when I was a frightened child during thunderstorms, that song was the song he had hummed back to the soldier. It was his gift. It was the only gift he had to give." Zollner opened his eyes and looked at Charlotte. "And he never knew the soldier's name." Charlotte stepped forward. "His name," she said quietly, "was Samuel Bennett." "Samuel Bennett," Zollner repeated, the name barely audible, as if he were testing the shape of it on his tongue, as if he had been waiting his entire life to know it. "Samuel Bennett." He said it a third time, and the third time it came out broken. "Forgive me. Forgive me. My father searched. He searched, And he died not knowing. Charlotte shook her head gently. He did not die not knowing, maestro. He died not knowing the name. But he did not die not knowing the friendship. My great-grandfather searched, too. After the war, when he came home to Macon, Georgia, he wrote letters. He wrote to the Red Cross. He wrote to Jewish refugee organizations in New York. He wrote to a Romanian-American newspaper in Cleveland. He had only a first name and a memory of a young man's face. He never found him. But he taught his daughter, my grandmother Ruby, the song that had been given to him. He taught it to her when she was 3 years old. And he told her, "Baby, this song belongs to a man named Iosif. If you ever meet a child who knows this song, you give it back. You hear me? You give it back to that child. Because this song was a gift, and gifts are meant to be returned someday, when the time is right." Charlotte's voice was steady, but the tears were now moving freely down her cheeks. My great-grandfather Samuel died in 1987. He was 65 years old. He had spent his life as a janitor at a public high school in Macon, because there were not many jobs available for a black veteran in the South in those years, even one who had liberated a concentration camp. He played his trumpet at the school's football games on Friday nights. He hummed the song from Buchenwald every Sunday morning while he was shaving. He told my grandmother, in the last week of his life, that he hoped Iosif had made it home. He hoped Iosif had lived. He hoped Iosif had married and had children and grandchildren. And he hoped that someday, somehow, the song would find its way back to the family it had come from. Frank Zollner pressed both of his hands against his eyes. His shoulders shook. Yevgeny Petrov, still kneeling beside him, finally spoke, in a voice so soft that only Zollner could hear him. "Frank," the old cellist whispered, "stand up. Stand up now. There is something you need to do." Zollner nodded slowly. He allowed Yevgeny to help him to his feet. He swayed for a moment, gripping the railing of the podium, and then he turned to face Charlotte. He took 2 steps toward her, then a third, until he was standing on the open stage with his back to the empty audience and his face level with hers. He was perhaps 3 inches taller than she was. He looked down into her eyes, and the contempt that had been there 20 minutes earlier had been burned entirely out of him. What remained was a man who had spent 40 years carrying a question, and who had just been answered. "Miss Bennett," he said, and then he stopped, because Miss Bennett did not feel right. "Charlotte," he said. "I have spent my career building a reputation for what I believe to be excellence. I have humiliated young musicians in front of their colleagues. I have used my position to make people feel small. I have told myself, for 50 years, that this was the discipline of the European tradition, that this was how greatness was forged. I told myself this even as I watched my father, who had lived through the worst thing that human beings have ever done to one another, treat every stranger he met with a kindness that I never possessed. I never understood the gap between him and me. I think I am beginning to understand it now." He took a slow breath. "What I said to you 20 minutes ago, in front of this orchestra, was beneath the dignity of this hall. It was beneath the dignity of my father's memory. It was beneath the dignity of the man whose granddaughter you are. I cannot unsay it. I would not insult you by pretending that I could. But I can say, in front of these musicians, in front of these phones that I see recording from the wings, in front of God if God is listening, that I was wrong. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about your playing. I was wrong about what this song was, what this morning was, what this entire 40 years of searching was. I have been wrong about a great many things. And I am asking your forgiveness, although I do not believe I have earned it." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised every musician on that stage. She reached out, and she took both of his hands in hers. Her hands were warm, and they were steady, and they held his with the gentle, unhurried grip of a woman who had been taught from childhood that forgiveness is not a feeling but a decision, and that the decision must be made by the person who has been wronged, not demanded by the person who has wronged them. The orchestra watched in stunned silence. Marcus Johnson, the principal violist, lowered his head and pressed his palm against his eyes. David Horowitz, the concertmaster, set his violin gently on his chair and rose to his feet. One by one, around the stage, the musicians of the New York Philharmonic began to stand. Not in applause. Not in protest. Simply in witness. They stood the way one stands at a funeral or a wedding or any other moment in which something has changed permanently and must be honored with the body's full attention. Maestro Zollner, Charlotte said quietly, still holding his hands, my grandmother told me something once. She told me that the song was a gift, and that a gift cannot be a gift if it comes with a condition. She told me that when the moment came, I was to give it freely. So I give it to you freely. The song is yours. It has always been yours. It was never anyone else's to keep. She paused, and her voice, when it returned, was still gentle but had taken on a new note, something quieter and firmer beneath the softness. But Maestro, I want you to understand something else. The orchestra members in this hall watched what you did to me this morning. They watched, and they sat in silence, the way they have sat in silence many times before, because they were afraid of you. And in a few hours, the recordings of what you did to me will be on the internet, and millions of people will watch them, and they will judge what you did. I cannot stop that, and I would not stop it if I could, because the truth is the truth, and the truth has its own work to do in the world. The forgiveness I offer you is for me. It is not for the historical record. It is not for the public. It is for me, because I will not carry your cruelty into the rest of my life. But the consequences of what you did, those belong to you. I cannot take those away. I would not if I could. Zollner nodded. His head was bowed, and his hands were shaking inside hers, but he nodded with the steady acceptance of a man who had finally stopped fighting. He gently disengaged his hands from hers, and he turned, slowly, to face the orchestra. His musicians stood in a great curving arc around the stage, 98 of them, in their rehearsal clothes, with their instruments in their hands or resting on their chairs, and they watched him with expressions that ranged from grief to anger to wonder to something close to relief. My friends, he said, and his voice carried, although it was quiet. My friends, I have served as the music director of this orchestra for 11 years. I have demanded of you a level of discipline that I claimed was the standard of the European masters. I have used that discipline as a cover for cruelty. I have used my position as a stage from which to belittle people whose only crime was to be different from the narrow tradition in which I was trained. I have done this to my colleagues, and I have done it to my guests, and I have done it to my students. I have done it most of all to musicians whose backgrounds and skin colors and origins did not match the imaginary aristocracy of conservatory that I carried in my head. I have used the word European as if it were a synonym for excellent. It is not. It never was. And the man who would have been most disappointed in me for using it that way was my own father, who came to America in 1949 and who knew, better than I will ever know, what happens when human beings decide that one tradition is superior to another. He paused. He looked across the stage at Linda Castellanos, who had now walked down to the front row and was standing at the rail with both of her hands pressed against her chest. He looked at the two stagehands in the wings, whose phones were still recording. He looked at Charlotte, who stood beside him with her hands now folded calmly in front of her dress. Effective at the conclusion of this rehearsal, Frank Zollner said, I am resigning my position as music director of the New York Philharmonic. A gasp rippled through the orchestra. Several of the musicians turned to look at one another. Zollner held up his hand, asking for silence, and they gave it to him. I will not contest my contract. I will not negotiate a settlement. I am stepping down, today, because I am no longer the man who deserves to lead this orchestra, and perhaps I never was. And I want to make one final statement before I step off this stage, Zollner continued, his voice gathering itself for one last effort. It is not within my authority to name my own successor. That decision belongs to the board of this institution and to its general manager, Linda Castellanos, who is standing at the rail before me. He inclined his head in her direction. But I can offer a recommendation. And I will offer it now, in front of these witnesses, in front of these recordings, in front of God if God is listening to the music being made in this hall today. I recommend that the New York Philharmonic invite Miss Charlotte Bennett to serve as artist in residence for the remainder of this season, and that the board consider her, very seriously, for a permanent position of artistic leadership when the time comes. She has more musicianship in the first 3 notes of that melody than I have shown in 11 years of standing on this podium. She has more dignity in the way she carries herself this morning than I have shown in 71 years of being alive. And she is the granddaughter of the man who saved my father's life. I owe her, and her family, a debt that I cannot repay in this lifetime. But I can begin, today, by stepping out of her way. He turned to Charlotte one last time, and he bowed. He did not bow shallowly, the way conductors sometimes bow to soloists at the end of a concerto. He bowed deeply, from the waist, the way one bows in old Europe to acknowledge that one is in the presence of something greater than oneself. And then he straightened, and he removed his conductor's baton from the music stand, and he placed it carefully into Charlotte's hand. He closed her fingers gently around it. And he walked off the stage of Carnegie Hall, and he did not look back. The recordings from the wings reached the internet within 90 minutes. Within 6 hours, the video of Charlotte playing the melody had been viewed 7 million times. Within 3 days, it had been viewed 86 million times. Within a week, classical music critics from London, Vienna, Tokyo, and Buenos Aires had written long essays about what they had witnessed. The Romanian Cultural Institute reached out to Charlotte and confirmed that the melody was indeed a folk song from northern Maramures, of a kind that had nearly been wiped out during the Holocaust along with the Jewish communities that had sung it. 3 elderly survivors in Israel, who had been children in the same region as Frank Zollner, came forward to say that they had heard the song as little ones and that they had believed it was lost forever. They wept on camera when they heard Charlotte's recording. Charlotte accepted the position of artist in residence. She did not move into Frank Zollner's old office. She asked, instead, for a smaller room on the 2nd floor, with a window that looked out onto 7th Avenue, the same 7th Avenue down which Maestro Zollner had once said a street busker had wandered. She kept her grandmother's small leather folder on the desk beside her, open to the page that bore the date April 16, 1945, and the 3 Romanian words at the top. She visited Frank Zollner at his apartment on the Upper West Side twice a month. They drank tea. They spoke about his father. They spoke about her great-grandfather. They listened to old recordings of Romanian folk music. He never conducted professionally again. He spent the remaining years of his life helping young musicians from underrepresented backgrounds prepare for major auditions, free of charge, in the small studio he set up in his spare bedroom. In the lobby of Carnegie Hall, beside the bronze busts of the great conductors of the past century, there is now a small framed copy of a yellowed page of handwritten music. The original is kept in a climate-controlled archive at the Library of Congress, donated by the Bennett family in 2023. The frame in the lobby bears a simple inscription beneath the music, "For our friend. April 16, 1945. A gift between strangers who became family. May we always be brave enough to hum." And so the song, which had been carried out of a German concentration camp in the breath of a dying violinist, hummed back to him by a young black soldier from Macon, Georgia, taught by that soldier to his daughter, taught by his daughter to her granddaughter, and played at last on the stage of Carnegie Hall to the only person in the world who could recognize what it was, the song had found its way home. Never underestimate the power of a melody carried gently through the dark. Share this story if you believe that the smallest acts of human kindness can echo across generations and continents. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories of dignity meeting cruelty and changing the world. Subscribe, because the most beautiful stories are the ones that remind us we are all carrying gifts that someone else needs. Your song could be next. Some music never dies. Peace.